It's a war that has lasted for over 300 years. A war with no battles, no deaths, and most amazingly, no one even noticed it was happening until now. What is this weird war about, and why did it last so long? The answer to both those questions is very simple. It's because of pigeons. Yep, you heard me right, pigeons. But don't get too excited yet. There are two things you should know about this war before getting angry at how little attention is paid to such an important issue like the Anglo Spanish War. First of all, it ended in 1897, so you won't be able to join in on the fun. Secondly, this war was fought between Britain and Spain, which means you'll have to move to Europe to fight. So unless you're a big fan of pigeons or live in Europe, you probably won't care about this war. But if you do live in Europe or just love pigeons, then get ready because this is the story of the world's most boring war. For centuries, birds have been used for communication, food, and entertainment. In fact, many species have been domesticated specifically for these purposes. But perhaps the most famous use for birds throughout history is as messengers. Back in the day, they were the equivalent of modern-day text messages. They could deliver messages faster than any other method and were much more discreet. For example, when Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, he would communicate with his family through pigeons. But the ability of pigeons to carry messages quickly and efficiently became especially useful during wartime. In fact, pigeons played a huge role in World War II. They delivered urgent messages, allowing Allied troops to escape ambushes and helped coordinate military operations. One pigeon saved more than 200 lives and was awarded an animal medal for its bravery. Another pigeon was able to guide soldiers to downed pilots who had survived their crash and deliver first aid kits and water. There were even female pigeons who would lay eggs while on missions. Of course, these eggs weren't fertilized since male pigeons couldn't fertilize them. Instead, they were mostly used as a source of protein for people stranded behind enemy lines. But pigeons weren't only used by the Allies. Germany also trained thousands of pigeons to deliver messages and save lives. In total, pigeons were responsible for delivering around 45% of all battlefield messages. World War II, this was partly because they were cheaper and easier to train than dogs, but mainly because they were available in larger numbers. Pigeons are among the most common birds in the world, and every country has them. And it is thanks to these birds that we are able to look back and say that we are living in the greatest period of peace in human history. Well, maybe not the greatest, but definitely one of the longest periods of peace ever. You see, the Anglo Spanish War, also known as the Pigeon War, started shortly after the Treaty of Torres. In 1494, this treaty divided the world into two spheres of influence, one for Portugal and another for Spain. But there was a problem. Neither Portugal nor Spain actually controlled most of their respective sides. For example, Spain had claimed Florida, but England was already exploring the area. So what would happen if two European powers met on neutral territory? Would it be considered Spanish or Portuguese? To avoid confusion in situations like this, the two countries agreed that any land discovered by either of them would belong to them, provided that they landed on it. However, this created a loophole that allowed other countries, such as France, England, and the Netherlands, to take advantage of. All they had to do was send someone or something to any uninhabited island or piece of land before the other countries did. Technically speaking, this meant that the race to colonize the New World was actually a race to send birds there first. And this is where our feathered friends come in. In the 16th century, both Spain and Portugal began sending ships full of birds to various parts of the Americas and Africa. They would land a few birds on the ground and then sail away. The first country to return to that place and find the birds would claim the land for itself. This was the case for Brazil, which was originally claimed by the Portuguese but was later taken by the Dutch. The same thing happened in Florida, which was originally claimed by Spain but was later taken by the British. And this is how the Anglo-Spanish War began. It wasn't really a war though. There were no battles or bloodshed. Instead, it was a contest to see who could colonize more territory. Basically it was, whoever had the most pigeons on the ground, they owned the land. But there was a problem. Both countries sent their birds to the exact same places, meaning they were always competing against each other. The British even accused the Spanish of purposely following them around to steal their birds. So the two countries met up and agreed to divide the world into two halves. This line of demarcation ran through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, giving each country half of the world to explore and conquer. However, the treaty didn't specify exactly where the line should be drawn, only that it should be somewhere in the middle. The result was that both sides began claiming lands that were well beyond the middle of the ocean, resulting in overlap. The next treaty, the Treaty of Zaragoza, attempted to fix this by specifying exactly where the dividing line would be. It basically cut the Atlantic in half, giving Spain everything west of the line and Portugal everything east of it. However, this still didn't solve the problem because it didn't cover areas that were closer to Europe. So the two countries continued fighting over these territories until they finally agreed on the Canary Islands as the dividing point in 1667. After this, the competition between the two countries became even more intense because the rules changed. Now that there were clear borders, they could actively try to invade each other's territories. It wasn't easy, though. As soon as one country landed on an island, the other country would immediately send a ship to take it back. There was no way to permanently occupy any land without a massive army. So the war turned into a game of hot potato. This went on for centuries with neither side gaining any ground. That's why the war was called the Pigeon War. Even today, it's still considered the longest war in history. And it's only recently that we've learned about it. There were a few reasons for this. Firstly, it was a time when newspapers were expensive and rare, so not many people knew about the war. Secondly, the war was so boring that no one really cared. There were no battles or casualties, so why would anyone bother reading about it? Finally, the war wasn't officially declared. So many people didn't even realize it was going on. All of this makes you wonder why the two countries didn't just end the war once they realized they were wasting their money and resources. After all, it wasn't like anyone was benefiting from the war. Well, technically speaking, it was the British who benefited the most. They gained the Canary Islands, which were a valuable source of sugar, wine, and livestock. Other than that, though, the war wasn't really beneficial for either side. Eventually, the two countries realized this and decided to put an end to the war. The Treaty of Utrecht. This treaty also ended the war between Spain and Portugal, which had been going on since 1640. As a result, the three countries were now at peace, marking the beginning of the longest period of peace in European history. So remember all those times your parents told you that war wasn't a game? Well, the Anglo Spanish War was literally a game played by kings, queens, and yes, even pigeons. This might make you think that the war was pointless, but that's not entirely true. You see, the war may have been pointless, but the peace that followed it was extremely valuable. It allowed European nations to focus on other things, like for example exploring the New World. It also gave them time to grow their economies, develop new technologies, and improve the lives of their citizens. In other words, the Anglo-Spanish War may have been pointless, but the peace that followed it was the foundation for centuries of prosperity in Europe.